The fastest gunslinger in Texas laid down his guns for a deaf girl. There are men in Texas who are remembered for what they built, and there are men remembered for what they destroyed. Jedediah Colton was, for most of his life, the second kind. They called him the fastest hand west of the Brazos. Some said he could clear leather and put a bullet through a playing card before the card touched the ground. Others said he'd killed 11 men and never lost a night's sleep over a single one of them. Both stories were exaggerations, but not by much. By the time our story begins, Jed Colton was 32 years old, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the miles behind him. He rode into a sun-bleached nothing of a town called Dust Hollow on a grey gelding, his black duster coat thick with trail dust, 2 ivory-handled revolvers riding low on his hips like they'd grown there. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. Trouble simply had a way of finding men like him, the way vultures find a wound before it starts to smell. Dust Hollow was the kind of town that existed because a stagecoach line needed somewhere to stop between 2 places that mattered more: a saloon, a livery, a dry goods store, a church with a bell nobody rang anymore, and, at the edge of town where the grass still remembered how to grow, the Hale family horse ranch. Jed hadn't meant to stay. He'd meant to water his horse, buy supplies, and keep riding toward Mexico, where a man with his kind of history could disappear if he tried hard enough. But then he saw her. She was standing in the shade outside the dry goods store, and she was talking with her hands. Fast, fluid, graceful movements like she was conducting an orchestra only she could hear. An older man, her father, though Jed didn't know that yet, was signing back to her, and the two of them were laughing, really laughing, the kind of laughter that comes easy in families that love each other. Jed had forgotten what that looked like. Her name was Rosalind Hale, Rosie, to the handful of people in Dust Hollow who loved her, which was nearly everyone. She'd lost her hearing to a fever when she was 6 years old, and in the 19 years since, she'd built a whole world out of sign and expression and the sharp, careful attention of someone who has learned to read a room with her eyes instead of her ears. She could tell you a storm was coming before the clouds arrived just by watching how the birds moved. She could tell a liar by the set of his shoulders before he opened his mouth. And on that particular afternoon, she could tell that the stranger standing across the street, watching her with his hat pulled low, was carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with saddlebags. Jed didn't approach her that day. Men like him had learned the hard way to stay separate from anything soft enough to be used against them. He bought his supplies, avoided the saloon, and made camp a mile outside of town, telling himself he'd be gone by sunup. He was not gone by sunup. There's a particular kind of trouble that finds a fast gun in a small town, and it found Jed before his coffee had gone cold. 2 young cowhands, drunk on cheap whiskey and cheaper reputation, decided they wanted to know if the stories about the stranger were true. They found him at the livery, and one of them made the mistake of reaching first. It was over in less than 2 seconds. Jed didn't kill either of them. He was better than that, or maybe just tired of that, but he put a bullet through one man's hat and another through the second man's belt buckle, close enough to feel the wind of it, and both of them went white as bone and apologized so fast they nearly fell over each other doing it. By the time the sheriff arrived, Jed was already saddling his horse to leave. That's when Rosie found him. She'd seen the whole thing from the porch of the dry goods store, seen it, not heard it, which meant she'd watched every movement with the kind of clarity that sound might have blurred. She'd seen a man who could have killed 2 fools and chose not to. She walked straight up to him, unafraid in a way that surprised him, and signed something he couldn't understand. Her father, Thomas Hale, came jogging up behind her, out of breath, half apologetic. "She wants to know why you didn't shoot them," he translated. "She says most men who can do." Jed looked at this woman with the steady hazel eyes and the fearless posture, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he answered a question honestly. "Didn't seem worth the weight it had put on me," he said. Thomas signed the words. Rosie studied Jed's face for a long moment, the way she studied storm clouds and liars, and then she nodded, like he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. That should have been the end of it. A stranger passing through, a moment of grace, a story to tell later. But Thomas Hale, sensing something in the tired lines of Jed's face, made him an offer instead, a week's work breaking horses, in exchange for a hot meal and a roof that didn't move under him. Jed told himself he only stayed for the meal. He stayed for 6 weeks. If you're finding yourself hoping this gunslinger finally gets the peace he's chasing, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because Sunset Tales has a whole frontier full of stories like this one waiting for you. And trust me, you'll want to be here when the next one rides in. On the third night, unable to sleep, Jed found himself sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, watching the horses move like shadows in the moonlight. He didn't hear Rosie approach. Of course he didn't. She'd learned long ago how to move through a world that couldn't hear her either. But he felt the fence shift as she climbed up beside him. She didn't sign anything. She simply sat with him, watching the same horses, breathing the same night air, and Jed understood for the first time in years what it meant to share silence with another person instead of hiding inside it alone. He told her about his father that night, in the fragments of sign language he'd picked up, and the words Thomas had taught him to shape slowly with his hands. A hard man, a harder ranch, and a first gun placed in Jed's palm before he was old enough to understand what it would cost him. He told her about the first man he'd ever drawn on, not killed, just faced, and the sick, hollow feeling that had followed him ever since, the sense that every year added another weight to a scale that could never balance back to even. Rosie listened with her whole body, the way she listened to everything, and when he finished, she reached out and touched the center of his chest, right over his heart, and signed a single word her father had taught Jed just that morning. Enough. Those 6 weeks changed something in Jed Colton that 6 years of running never had. He learned to break a horse the way Thomas taught him, with patience instead of force. He learned to sign, clumsily at first, his big scarred hands fumbling over letters that Rosie taught him with endless generous patience. He learned that silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything Rosie noticed that everyone else missed. The way morning light caught the dust in the barn like floating gold. The particular quiet of a horse deciding to trust you. The rhythm of a life built around watching instead of waiting to be told. And Rosie learned things too. She learned that the stranger's hands, which could draw a revolver faster than most men could blink, were gentlest of all when they were signing her name wrong and laughing at himself for it. She learned that underneath the reputation was a man who flinched, just slightly, every time a door slammed too hard, and that the flinching wasn't weakness, it was memory. She learned that she was falling in love with him somewhere between the 3rd week and the 4th, though she'd never admit exactly when. Evenings, they'd sit on the porch while the sky burned orange and violet over the plains, and Jed would tell her in halting sign and simple words her father helped translate about the life he was trying to leave behind, the men he'd faced, the reputation that followed him like a shadow with its own agenda, the particular loneliness of being feared instead of known. "I don't want that life anymore," he told her one evening, the sunset painting both their faces gold. "I want this. I want quiet. I want you." Rosie's answer wasn't in words. She reached over and unbuckled his gun belt herself, slow and deliberate, and hung it on the porch post like it was just another piece of tack to be put away for the night. Jed watched her do it, and something in his chest that had been clenched for a decade finally, quietly, let go. There was a Sunday, near the end of the 5th week, when Thomas Hale invited half the county to the ranch for a barn dance, the kind of gathering that small towns throw together out of fiddles, borrowed lanterns, and an excuse to forget their troubles for one evening. Jed had never danced in his life, Men who spent their years watching exits and counting distances rarely learn to move for joy instead of survival. But Rosie pulled him onto the packed dirt floor anyway, guiding his hands and his feet through a rhythm she felt through the vibration of the fiddle strings against the barn wood beneath her boots. He stepped on her feet twice and apologized both times with such genuine horror that she laughed until she had to lean against him just to stay upright. Watching them, Thomas Hale allowed himself, for the first time since his wife had passed years earlier, to believe that his daughter had found someone who would stand between her and the world, without ever asking her to be smaller for it. He should have known better than to think it would be that simple. The trouble came riding into Dust Hollow on a hot Thursday afternoon. 3 men wide across the main street, dust rising behind them like a warning. Their leader was a man named Silas Marrow, a bounty hunter with a scar across his cheek and a reputation nearly as ugly as Jed's own. Silas had been chasing Jed's trail for the better part of a year, not for the law, but for a bounty placed by the family of a man Jed had killed years earlier in a fight that hadn't been his choosing. Silas didn't care about justice. He cared about the money on Jed Colton's head, and he'd found it finally in a town too small to hide a man like that. Word reached the ranch by sundown, carried by a frightened stable boy who'd overheard Silas asking questions in the saloon. Thomas wanted to send Rosie away, to a cousin's place 2 counties over, safe and far from whatever was coming. Rosie refused. She signed her answer so fast and so fierce that her father didn't need to translate it for Jed to understand. "I am not leaving. Not you. Not this." Jed stood on the porch that night, looking at the gun belt still hanging on the post where Rosie had left it weeks ago, dust settling into the leather. He'd promised himself and her that he was done. But Silas Marrow wasn't the kind of man who respected promises, and he wasn't coming for a conversation. "If I put these back on," Jed told her, his hands slow and careful with the signs she'd taught him, "I don't know if I can ever take them off again." Rosie stepped close, took his rough hands in her smaller ones, and pressed them flat against her heart so he could feel it beating, steady and unafraid. Then she signed something simple, something he understood without needing translation at all. "Come back to me, whatever it takes." Silas Marrow and his 2 men rode onto Hale land at first light, positioning themselves at the edge of the corral like they owned the ground beneath them. Jed walked out to meet them alone, his duster coat open, his hands empty at his sides. No belt, no holster, nothing but a man standing in the open, asking for a different ending than the one that had always found him before. "Come to collect," Silas called out, his voice carrying flat across the yard. "Dead or walking, don't much matter to me which." "I'm not that man anymore," Jed said. Silas laughed, short and ugly. "Man like you doesn't get to retire. Somebody's always going to come collecting on what you owe." It was Thomas who broke first, rushing out with an old shotgun he barely knew how to aim. And it was that moment of chaos, a father's fear outrunning his sense, that gave Silas the excuse he'd been looking for. His hand moved toward his own weapon, and Jed, who had spent 6 weeks learning to live without the guns, discovered in that half-second that some instincts don't disappear, they just wait. He crossed the yard faster than thought, closing the distance before Silas could clear his holster, and put him on the ground with nothing but his hands and the hard-won discipline of a man who'd once been the fastest gun in Texas and had simply chosen, finally, a different kind of fast. The 2 remaining men, watching their leader disarmed and pinned in the dirt without a single shot fired, lost whatever appetite they'd had for the fight. They rode off before the dust had even settled, leaving Silas Marrow face down in the yard, his bounty uncollected, his reputation smaller than the story he'd ridden in on. Jed Colton had won the fight of his life without ever touching a gun. That evening, as the sun dropped low and gold over the Hale ranch, Jed walked to the porch, unhooked the gun belt from where it had hung untouched, and carried it out past the corral, past the tree line, to the slow-moving creek that marked the edge of Thomas Hale's land. Rosie walked beside him, her hand in his, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. He knelt at the water's edge and buried the revolvers there, beneath the roots of an old cottonwood tree, not because he was ashamed of who he'd been, but because he'd finally found something worth becoming instead. When he stood, Rosie was watching him with those steady hazel eyes, and for the first time since he'd ridden into Dust Hollow, Jed Colton let himself believe that a man could outrun his own reputation if he just found the right reason to stop running. Years later, the story of the fastest gun in Texas would take on a different ending than the one people expected. Travelers passing through Dust Hollow would hear it told at the saloon, not as a tale of gunfights and bounties, but as a love story. They'd hear about the gunslinger who laid down his weapons at the edge of a creek, and the deaf rancher's daughter who taught him that the loudest thing in the world isn't a gunshot, it's a heart, finally allowed to be still. Jed and Rosie were married that autumn, in a small ceremony on the porch where he'd once hung his guns and where she'd once unbuckled them. He never wore a gun belt again. He learned to speak with his hands as fluently as he'd once drawn a revolver, and their ranch became known, in time, not for danger, but for the sight of a tall man in a black duster teaching children, his own eventually and half the town's besides, how to sign their names in the dust with a stick, laughing at every mistake the way Rosie had once laughed at his. Some men are remembered for what they destroyed. Jedediah Colton, in the end, was remembered for what he chose to build, a quiet life, a full heart, and a love that never once needed to raise its voice. If this story found its way to your heart tonight, you know exactly what to do. Like it, share it, and stay close, because Sunset Tales will be riding back into the frontier again soon with another story worth remembering. This has been Sunset Tales. Until next time, ride gentle and love harder than you fight.